Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Spoken Grates podcast. Now, to start with, I have with me here a San Remy XO Brandy, which I'll be drinking throughout. Please let me know in the comments what you're going to be drinking with me. I'm drinking this because it's an XO Brandy, which means extra old. It's been aged in the barrel at least 10 years, which gives to it a certain complexity. And it was only till very recently that XO brandies were actually aged for 6 years. And the other name that they were given was Napoleon. And that's the actual topic of this podcast today. I'm going to be looking again at Napoleon's Maxims of War to see what lessons we can extract from it for modern warfare and geopolitics in general. So let's take a sip of this brandy and sit back, relax, and let's enjoy it. That is smooth stuff. So let's kick it off. I'll try and cover as many Maxims as I can today. I might skip a few if I think they're too specific to the historical period and not enough to extract a lesson from. So the first Maxim: the frontiers of states are either large rivers or chains of mountains or deserts. Of all these obstacles to the march of an army, the most difficult to overcome are deserts. Mountains come next, and broad rivers occupy the third place. So if you look at the borders of most countries, they follow a natural boundary. And as Napoleon describes here, it will usually be something like a mountain range or a river. If we look at the example of France, if you look on the map in southwest France, the border is with Spain in the Pyrenees Mountains, and in the southeast with Switzerland and Italy, it's in the Alps. And then Germany, you've got the Rhine, which leaves the only real weak spot is in Belgium. The border with Belgium. That is part of a wider geographical feature, which is known as the Northern European Plain, which is relatively flat terrain. And this stretches from northern France all the way to the Ural Mountains in central Russia. And this kind of terrain is quite easy to move around in, which from a military perspective means it's easy to invade. And when you have terrain like that, it kind of leaves an open question about where the border should be, which is why countries tend to fight conflicts up until they can secure some kind of natural boundary to contain themselves in. And if you look at the conflict with Russia and Ukraine today, where the border between Russia and Ukraine should be is, at least from a geographical perspective, is kind of an open question, because that terrain there is not really separated by any natural boundary to demarcate the border. And so what you're left with is whatever political or cultural background goes into it. Whereas historically, you would have had the Dnipro River, which cuts straight through the middle of Ukraine, dividing the two. And so you tend to see conflict where there is no natural boundary to clearly mark where a border should be. And so, as Napoleon alludes to here, the desert is the most difficult place to operate in. It's 1 billion degrees in the shade. You've got no cover, no protection or camouflage. Just purely surviving is incredibly difficult because you need to bring all of your water with you. Even in the age of armored vehicles, they're still prone to immense maintenance difficulties in the desert, where if you get dust or sand in an engine, it can render it quite useless. Even down to weapon maintenance in the desert just gets a lot more complicated. And so trying to move a large force through a desert efficiently and tactically is a very difficult maneuver to do. Mountains, I think, speak for themselves. It's very steep terrain. And even today, most modern vehicles above a certain gradient can't pass through such passes. And it's a bottleneck as well. You're being channeled into a narrow area where you can be vulnerable on multiple flanks. And that's the case as well with river crossings as well. You've got essentially a bottleneck there whenever you're crossing, and obviously you can't maneuver into cover when you're halfway across a large river. So yeah, very much applicable to today. So that's Maxim 1. Let's take a look at Maxim 2. In forming a plan of a campaign, one must foresee everything the enemy may do and be prepared with the necessary means to counteract it. Plans of campaigns may be modified ad infinitum according to circumstances, the genius of the commander, the character of the troops, and the topography of the theatre of war. I think this has taken on even more importance today than it did at the time that Napoleon wrote this. When you look at how much governments invest in espionage, in collection efforts for intelligence agencies, trying to predict what the enemy may do, it gives a strong advantage in planning. And if you can predict the unpredictable, foresee the unforeseeable, easier said than done, then you can kind of mitigate against some of the enemy's most severe actions, or what's commonly known as the most dangerous course of action. Now, I would argue that the most dangerous course of action is the one that you haven't considered. This is what would be known as the black swan. So the unknown, something that cannot be predicted, and hence causes the maximum effect because there are no preparations in place for such a thing. And so a very common practice today in the military is something known as red teaming. This is where you take the enemy's perspective and you try and war game what you would do if you were the enemy. Now, there's clearly some flaws in this process because you are assuming that you know how the enemy thinks, which is quite unlikely. When you're going through this process, you are thinking how you think the enemy thinks, which may be totally different to how the enemy actually thinks. But nevertheless, it's still an effective tool to put yourself in the perspective of the other actor, because the enemy has a vote as well. And this, even extends to the world of business today, and businesses will consider the actions of their competitors and then how they will respond accordingly to the launch of a new product or service. And taking in these considerations aids the planning process and ensures that there's contingencies in place when things don't go to plan. Now, he goes on to talk about the different factors affecting warfare, and he quite rightly says these are infinite. There's so many different things which can come into play, from the equipment, the training, the morale of the troops, how good the commander is, the economic situation, the political saliency to use force. So many different factors. It would be impossible to quantitatively measure. But I would argue some things are constant, and this is a reason why books like this, and also The Art of War, Klaus Fitz on war as well, they're still studied in military academies throughout the world today, because certain principles don't change, such as the importance of terrain. We all operate in time and space, and despite the best efforts of technology and advancements in vehicles, we're still limited to the spaces that human beings occupy. And so a hill is a hill. That does not change whether you're a heavy cavalry unit in the 19th century or a tank regiment in the 21st century. You're still going to be heavily restricted of movement through a dense forest or an urban area, for example. So these things stay pretty constant, and that's why these books are quite timeless. So we're going to skip number 3, and we're going to take a look at, we can skip number 4 even. We're going to take a look at number 5. So war should be made methodically, for it should have a definite object, and it should be conducted according to the principles and rules of the art. It should be made with forces proportionate to the obstacles which can be foreseen. So Klaus Fitz also talks about this in his book on war, that war ultimately is an extension of politics by other means, by military means. It's the final answer to the question, so what? Or what are you going to do about it? If you can't achieve your aims by diplomacy, by economic cooperation, then ultimately force will have to be used. And if force is going to be used, then you need to determine what constitutes success. A state has a finite amount of resources which it can allocate to a military objective. It can't bet the whole farm on an action. Some states have, and ultimately have fallen for that. So if you don't set a maximum price that you're willing to pay in order to achieve an objective, then you end up with what something is known as mission creep. Now, mission creep is where you start off with a limited military operation. So, let's say you have a training mission or you have military advisors based on the ground. And then it slowly becomes an increasingly large operation until you've committed to a large-scale war, effectively. So you're starting off with advisors, and then maybe you get special forces on the ground, and then you conduct airstrikes until you're at the point where you've committed to a large-scale conventional conflict. Now, recent examples of this are the Vietnam War, and then subsequently the War on Terror, which I think, looking particularly at the case of the intervention in Afghanistan, there was, at the face of it, a lack of coherent strategy about what the United States and its allies wanted to achieve in Afghanistan. Was it about removing elements of Al-Qaeda, the group directly responsible for 9/11? Or did it evolve into removing the Taliban to remove Afghanistan as a safe haven for terrorism? Or was it about building an Afghan democracy? The aim seemed to shift all of the time. And if you look at the war in Afghanistan, by far the biggest problem child for NATO forces was Helmand province. This was a relatively unproductive province and consisted of about 1.5 million people out of a population of 40 million. And yet a great deal of the combat resources were allocated to trying to tame this province. And so what happened was the coalition forces got bogged down in a conflict in Helmand province against the Taliban. I would argue at the expense of the wider strategy about what it actually wanted to achieve as a whole in Afghanistan. I digress anyway. And generally, this is not always the case, because obviously a side is limited by its resources. But when one actor is more clear about what it wants to achieve in a conflict and the other one has no coherent policy, the one with the more coherent policy is more likely to succeed, because they know what their measures for success or failure are. And the result of 20 years in Afghanistan was that there wasn't really a sense of victory or defeat. And that's the danger, where you've not defined clearly enough what your aims are to start with. So absolutely still a very relevant principle to adhere to today. So let's take a look at Maxims 6. At the beginning of a campaign, to advance or not to advance is a matter for grave consideration. But once the offensive has been assumed, it must be maintained to the last extremity. However skillful the manoeuvres in a retreat may be, it will always weaken the morale of an army, because the chances of success pass to the enemy. Besides, retreats always cost more men and material than most bloody engagements, with this difference that in a battle the enemy's loss is nearly equal to your own, whereas in a retreat the loss is on your side only. Now this reminds me of another quote from Napoleon, which is, "If you're going to take Vienna, take Vienna." It's a reminder that decisive action is critical to military success. Now, in the 1970s, Colonel John Boyd of the US Air Force came up with the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, act. And what it was essentially a decision-making process for fighter pilots when engaged in a dogfight. So you would observe what the enemy is doing, you would orient yourself accordingly to what they are doing, so you understand properly, you would then decide what to do, and then you would act on it. Now, Boyd's theory was that the pilot with the most streamlined OODA loop would be the one that would win the dogfight. Now, this makes perfect sense, because if you think, if someone's waiting to make a decision when they have all the information available to them, so they're waiting until they have 90 to 100% of the information, and someone else is making a decision based on when they obtain 60% of the information. So on the balance of probability, it's more likely than not. And so they have what they need to make an action. If you iterate that several times, by the time that actor 1 has made their first action, actor 2 is already on their 4th or 5th action. And it's through that decisive action that you gain a military advantage over your enemy. Now, he talks about retreat here as well, and the risks about it. Retreats are very difficult to do and still maintain a sense of order. And it's incredibly demoralizing for everyone involved, as he rightly mentions here. Now, nevertheless, there are times where a force may be outnumbered and cannot match the firepower of the enemy, and they have no choice but to withdraw. But I think Napoleon here is trying to advocate that as an absolute last resort. And if you are able to go on the offensive, and maybe through a higher sense of aggression and taking more decisive action and simply acting faster than your enemy can respond to you, you can actually still preserve more of your force than if you were to just conduct a withdrawal. So let's talk about Maxim 7. An army should be ready at all hours, day and night, to resist to the limits of its capacity. This requires that the soldier have their arms and ammunition constantly with them, that the infantry have with it at all times its artillery, its cavalry, and its generals, and that the various divisions of the army be constantly ready to sustain, support, and protect one another. It also requires that the troops, whether halted in camp or on the march, be always in favourable positions, possessing the qualities required for a field of battle, to wit, that the flanks be well supported and that all the artillery be placed in good positions ready to fire. When an army is in column of march, it should have advanced guards and flanking parties to reconnoitre to the front, to the right and to the left, far enough to enable the main body to deploy and take position. Absolutely, I think that's very difficult to argue with, that you should be ready at all times for action against the enemy, because the most fragile and most devastating attack that an enemy can enact on you is when you're not prepared for it. And And so units need to be mutually supporting each other. You need a ring of air defense around your force. Artillery should be providing counter battery fire. Armor should be leading the assault. We're mutually supported by the infantry who can occupy positions. All of these need to be coordinating together. And when they're not, that's when things can go quite badly. So that leads quite nicely into Maxim 8, which is a commander-in-chief must ask himself several times a day, should the enemy appear on my front, on my right, or on my left, what would I do? If he is uncertain, his dispositions are faulty, and he should correct them. Absolutely. If you're not red teaming your actions and having contingencies in place for every possible action that conceivably the enemy could take, then you are in the most vulnerable position imaginable, because you have no means to respond effectively to an enemy's action. So yeah, absolutely, very, very applicable still. Let's take a look at Maxim 9. The strength of an army, like power in mechanics, is estimated by multiplying the mass by the velocity. A rapid march augments its morale and increases its means of victory. Absolutely, like I was talking about the OODA loop. If you're moving a lot faster, you can exact a much higher advantage than the other side. And often you may find the case where a side may have a numerical superiority, but along with that comes a much longer chain of command. And with that convoluted decision-making process, they actually can't use that numerical advantage properly because they can't act in time to respond to the enemy. So Maxim 10. With an army inferior in numbers, in cavalry and in artillery, a commander must avoid a general action. He must take up the deficiency in numbers by rapidity of movement, the want of artillery by the nature of its manoeuvres, and the inferiority in cavalry by the choice of positions. In such circumstances, the morale of a soldier is a great factor. Yeah, so he talks about certain manoeuvres to offset. If you don't have artillery, then you don't have the option to overwhelm the enemy with overwhelming firepower, which means you need to move faster than he can fix you into that position. And in terms of inferiority of cavalry, which we would translate to today as armor, if you don't have enough tanks, then picking ground which would render that armor less effective, such as woodlands, densely populated urban areas, or very steep terrain, that can offset some of the deficiencies there. And then he touches on morale here, and morale is very difficult to measure in a force, and it's clearly a very important factor, because if the troops don't want to fight, then it's over. But trying to quantify that is very difficult. Some people look at this from the perspective of, are they doing the little things still? So there's a theory that when morale is low, discipline also breaks down. So troops don't man their sentry positions, they don't admin themselves properly, and that could be an indicator that the force you're up against is low in morale, or it could just be a lack of professionalism. It's sometimes hard to distinguish between the two. So the next couple of maxims, there's some overlap and repetition. So I'm just going to read out Maxim 12, which is, an army must have but one line of operation. This line must be maintained with care and abandoned only for a major reason. So this goes back to what I was saying about having the end goal in mind when conducting a war. This is also true at the tactical level. Concentrating your resources on what it is that you're trying to achieve will maximize the chances of success. And so if your axis is in multiple directions, you've divided your efforts and effectively you've diminished the combat effectiveness of the forces that you have. What do we got here? Yeah, this is a good one. Maxim 16. It is a well-established maxim of war never to do what the enemy wishes you to do, for the simple reason that he desires it. Hence, a field of battle that he has reconnoitred and studied must be avoided, and even greater care must be taken to avoid a field which he has fortified, and in which he is entrenched. One corollary of this principle is never to attack in front a position which can be taken by turning. I think this one speaks for itself. If the enemy is prepared for the course of action you're going to take, the likelihood that they have measures in place to effectively stop what it is you're attempting to do is highly likely. Add into that the dangers of attacking a well-fortified position. It is an incredible waste of troops and resources. You only need to look at the recent conflict in Ukraine. If you look at particularly in the Donbass region, where arguably the same fight has been going on since 2014, where both sides have been launching full frontal assaults on heavily entrenched positions at a great cost of troops. And you could argue that redeploying those resources elsewhere by either side could have resulted in much more effective use of their resources. So next up is Maxim 19. The change from the defensive to the offensive is one of the most delicate operations in war. If you have to think about the preparations that you might have made for defenses in depth, where you've established obstacles such as dragon's teeth, you've laid mines, you've got barbed wire, you've dug trenches. If you're suddenly going on the offensive, well, all those obstacles that you've laid in front of the enemy, they're now in front of you as well. And so it's now a case of having to remove those obstacles to allow your offensive forces to advance. And that obviously becomes very precarious because you need to suppress the enemy sufficiently in order to be able to remove those obstacles without just opening a huge hole in your defenses before you've managed to conduct your counter-offensive. Now, staying with the theme of the Russia-Ukraine war, and both sides have conducted their own counter-offensives through the course of this war. And in the run-up to each respective one, there's been a lot of hype in the media, and then a sort of disappointment about the slow pace of things, or the failure to demonstrate some real tangible gains from that. But it just hits home how hard it is to go from the back foot to move to the offensive. You need time to gather your resources, because whilst you're gathering everything that you need to conduct an operation, from the personnel, the equipment, you're also at the same time trying to defend against the enemy's own advances. And so it's a very difficult balancing act to get those two right. And there's an open question there about do you trade space for time to allow you to better defend somewhere else, or do you allow some units to be under-resourced when they're being attacked, because you're holding back those resources for a future offensive action? it's an open question. It's context dependent, and there's so many different factors that go into that. But it's a very interesting one to think about. So I think we'll leave that there for today. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of the Spoken Grates podcast. We'll be covering more of the Maxims of War in future episodes, and indeed other topics. Please like and hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you soon.